Donald Kirk, good to speak with you again. Thanks for your time tonight. Now, I believe you've just attended a post-summit media conference by the South Korean president. What did he have to say?
Well, he listed all the great accomplishments of the summit, and he went through a wide range of successes, one of which caught my attention was the fact that they want to reduce the amount of HEU to LEU, a highly enriched uranium, to lower enriched uranium for medicinal and other purposes that have nothing to do with firing nuclear missiles or dropping bombs anywhere. So certainly there was a substantive agreement there, but the emphasis is on the word voluntary. I don't think that anything is truly a matter of law, although they do talk about enacting legislation in the various countries. But these people have got to follow the guidelines of this conference on a voluntary basis. And I should also add that President Lee probably spent more of his time talking about North Korea and the North Korean missile threat than he did about the results of the conference.
We'll certainly talk about that ourselves in a tick. So if after he's listed all these achievements, what has been achieved at this summit, is the world likely to be a safer place?
I beg your pardon, I didn't quite get that. Is there...
Given that President Lee listed this list of achievements arising from this summit, how likely is it the world will be a safer place then?
Well, I'm not at all sure. I think the world will be a safer place from nuclear terrorism. I think the idea of Al-Qaeda and others making off with loose nukes or nuclear material is terrifying to everybody. And I do think that there's a general commitment among the nations, the 50 or more leaders of nations, not to mention other agencies. I do think there's a general commitment to get tough in policing loose nukes, so to speak, or nuclear material. And there's also a commitment to reducing the amount of highly enriched uranium and to getting rid of nukes. But all of this is more or less voluntary, as noted. And I do think that probably on a voluntary basis they will make progress, but they have to do a lot more to make the world truly safe. Nonetheless, I would say, yes, on balance, the world may be a safer place as a result of this kind of conference.
Don, the AFP news agency has reported that a reference in a draft communique about the need for concrete steps towards a world without nuclear weapons was omitted from the final communique presented today. Why would that be? Were there any clues as to why that was omitted?
Well, obviously it was a little too definitive, I suppose you might say, a little too hard line for some people to really want to sign on to. It committed countries or leaders of countries in ways to which they really didn't quite want to be committed. That's the trouble with a conference like this. You get more than 50 people gathered together. Obviously, most of the work on the final communique was done before they even arrived here in Seoul, and most of what they were going to say was down there in their notes and briefings and all that beforehand. But still, there's quibbling over stuff like that, and it's inevitable that they wouldn't that some of them wouldn't want to be quite as definitive or definite as just talk about concrete steps.
So where does that leave President Obama's words, noble words from 3 years ago, where he was talking about working towards a world without nuclear weapons?
I'm sorry, again, I missed you. President Obama was talking about a world without nuclear weapons. Is that what you just asked me about?
Correct. Where does this leave? If something like that can be omitted from the communique, where does that leave those words of President Obama from 3 years ago, where he called for working towards a world without nuclear weapons?
Oh, I think President Obama is going home tonight maybe a little disappointed, but not very disappointed. I think he can live with that kind of semantic compromise in a final communique. He does talk about he did talk about in public speeches and a press conference how there are far too many nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads. Nobody needs all that many warheads simply for national defense. The emphasis should be on everybody getting rid of warheads. And clearly, ideally, everybody, including notably President Obama, would like a world without any nuclear weapons. But I think that he can go home satisfied that at least he's made some progress.
Don, let's talk about the very thing that it seemed nobody well, everyone wanted to talk about, but were loath to talk about at the summit, North Korea. And it seemed like in the lead up to and the conduct of the summit, it was reminiscent of a line from the old TV series Fawlty Towers, don't mention Pyongyang. And yet in the end, Pyongyang was mentioned around the sidelines, and you just mentioned Pyongyang was brought up by President Lee at his conference, and Japan raised the nuclear ambitions of North Korea as well. Tell us what sort of tension that whole presence created throughout the summit, the whole thing of not talking about North Korea except on the sidelines, and what was said by the leaders tonight.
Well, in fact, North Korea did give people something really to talk about. You know, this conference might not have been all that noticed had it not been for North Korea. So if one wants to be a little sardonic, one can say that President Lee has North Korea to thank for creating interest in the conference. He spent a lot of time talking about the dangers posed by North Korea's rocket launch, also holding out the possibility of all the great aid that North Korea would receive if only they acted nice. He said that a lot of times in the course of more than 4 years as president. And he's going to say it again. It's not new, but it just gave him another forum to repeat what he said many times before. And it also gave some immediacy to this conference. I'm sure that it got a lot more international coverage as a result of North Korea's plan to launch a rocket than it otherwise would have. So thank you, North Korea, for all the publicity.
Well, North Korea has said it intends to proceed with its controversial missile launch, this test. It says for the peaceful launch of a satellite. How do you predict, you know the Korean Peninsula so well, how do you predict this will play out between now, with the close of the summit, through to the mooted launch in mid-April?
Well, I think we're going to have a lot more palaver, a lot more statements, a lot more demands for North Korea to cease and desist. I would be extremely surprised if North Korea one day announced, we're sorry, we won't launch that missile after all. I don't quite think that's going to happen. I could be wrong, and we could have a good news story in which North Korea does indeed cancel plans for the launch. But that's most unlikely. So I think we're going to have a lot of that going on. And then North Korea is going to launch the missile. Everybody's going to get indignant. The United Nations will it'll be discussed in the United Nations. Who knows? And there might be increased sanctions, although it's hard to know exactly how they could increase the sanctions. And then eventually they'll go back to talks. And eventually, I would predict North Korea will wind up getting the food aid that the U.S. promised on February 29th, when North Korea supposedly promised a moratorium on all missile and nuclear tests. That's my perhaps rather jaded or cynical view of what's going to happen.
We'll put it down to an experienced view there, Don. Always great speaking with you. Thanks for making time at the close of the summit there to talk with us tonight.
Good talking to you.